On winter nights when the wind doesn't just blow but lashes sideways like a living creature trying to tear the earth open, the cold doesn't arrive gently the way we imagine. It drops like the violent slam of a giant steel door, sealing every escape in an instant. In 9th century Iceland, when the outside temperature plunged to 30 degrees Celsius, if someone opened the door for more than 3 seconds, the dense, compressed cold waiting outside would pour in like an invisible blade, sweeping along the dirt floor, devouring the warmth the family had guarded for hours, turning the house into an ice trap from a single moment of carelessness. There were no trees to break the wind, no daylight to warn of weather shifts, no modern materials to hold heat. Only a stretch of black volcanic earth, a heavy turf roof pressed down over a wooden frame, and a handful of people trying to keep their own breath from freezing right in front of them. This wasn't the beautiful, romantic winter from movies, but the kind of cold that could kill a cow in a few hours and ensure that anyone who slept in the wrong spot would never wake up again. And in that life or death reality, the Longhouse wasn't just a shelter. It was the final threshold between survival and the white void waiting outside. If you think you know what cold feels like, try picturing this and tell me, how long do you think you could survive? In every modern heat calculation, burning 54 kilograms of firewood a day in a space larger than 30 square meters should be nowhere near enough to stay warm. That flame, by normal logic, should vanish into the cold air after just a few hours, leaving behind a darkness thick with smoke and a chill so harsh it makes metal shrink. But the Vikings survived, and not just survived. They maintained a stable indoor temperature of around 12 degrees Celsius through the night, while outside sat at 30 degrees. A paradox that left archaeologists and modern engineers standing in silence when the measurements came in. No one could understand how a structure made of soil, grass, and mud could retain heat so effectively, or why a small pile of daily firewood was enough to keep a family alive in the North Atlantic winter.
What troubles you?
Because a longhouse wasn't a house in the way we think of it. It was a massive thermal engine designed to trap heat inside and reuse it over and over, turning human warmth, animal warmth, embers, and even smoke into layers of heat stacked upon one another. What makes this system almost illogical is the simple fact that it didn't work by adding more heat. It worked by refusing to let any heat escape. What do you think of this paradox? A tiny flame keeping an entire world alive. Many people still assume that the Viking Age took place during a milder climate, a period a few degrees warmer, so survival must have been easier than we imagine. But that's a major misconception, and that misconception hides a truth shocking enough to stop anyone in their tracks. Yes, the medieval climate anomaly did bring average temperatures up by about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, enough for vegetation to grow where it never had before. Enough for the Norse to bring livestock into Greenland and cultivate land that later generations couldn't survive on at all. But that warmth wasn't a blessing. It was a climate trap. Because when average temperatures rise, extreme cold events become rarer, but also more violent, deeper, and far harder to predict. The Vikings didn't live in a gentler world. They lived in a place where sudden cold snaps dropping to 30 degrees E could strike at any moment and wipe out an entire herd overnight. And the twist is this: that temporary warmth pushed them to expand too far, to rely too heavily on a housing and farming system engineered to run at its absolute limit. As soon as the climate dropped just 1 to 2 degrees Celsius again, when the Little Ice Age began, everything they built collapsed instantly. Greenland didn't die because it was too cold. It died because the Vikings had grown used to the abnormal warmth and couldn't pull back in time. This isn't just a story about weather anymore. It's a lesson in how easily humans can be betrayed by temporary advantages. If you ever thought a warmer climate meant an easier life, share your thoughts. Do you think we're repeating the same mistake the Norse once paid for with an entire civilization? When the climate began to shift and the Little Ice Age arrived, many people assumed Greenland collapsed because the winters became too cold. But the truth is far more brutal. The Norse survival system in Greenland was never built with any buffer. It was operating at maximum capacity from the very first day they arrived. Their longhouses maintained 12 degrees, not because they were powerful, but because they were engineered precisely for the unusually warm conditions of the medieval climate anomaly. They had no margin for colder weather, no reserve layer, no escape route. So when temperatures dropped just 1 to 2 degrees, a number so small we barely think about it today, their entire thermal, agricultural, livestock, and energy storage systems broke at the same time. Grass didn't grow enough, animals weakened, and even a few extra weeks of winter were enough to drain storage down to nothing. The turf houses that had once functioned like perfect heat retention machines suddenly couldn't compensate for those few lost degrees. And here's the detail that makes researchers shudder. The Norse didn't die from extreme cold. They died because their entire system was built too close to the edge. So even the slightest natural fluctuation was enough to bring down an entire civilization. That collapse isn't an ancient tragedy. It's a sharp warning for the present. If a way of life depends too heavily on favorable conditions, then all it takes is nature changing its mind just a little for everything to disappear. In continental Scandinavia, where oak and pine forests stretched endlessly, the Norse built longhouses with large timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and sturdy roofs. A model that sounds reasonable and traditional. But when they crossed the sea to Iceland and Greenland, where there was practically no real forest at all, everything flipped upside down. And this is where a paradox appears that still stuns people today. With no wood to build houses, they turned to frozen marshland. Thick blocks of turf, rectangular sod cut from wetlands, were stacked into walls more than a meter thick. A material modern people consider weak, damp, and easily rotten became the strongest survival brick they could possibly find. Not only did turf insulate better than wood, it held heat so well that it turned the entire home into a giant thermal mass, absorbing every tiny bit of warmth from humans, livestock, and the fire, then releasing it slowly for hours. And the biggest paradox is this: the cold, treeless land itself forced the Vikings to invent the most efficient heat-retaining houses they ever built. What looked like a complete disadvantage, marshes, wet soil, peat bogs, turned out to be the very thing that saved them from the white death outside. In a land where the wind could tear skin open and the cold could freeze a shovel solid in minutes, the Vikings created something that, at first glance, anyone would mistake as crude, a house covered in earth, grass, and mud. But when you step inside and run your hand across those walls, you realize a truth that sounds almost mythical. The 3 layers of what we'd call primitive material actually outperform modern wooden walls in heat retention. The inner layer is turf placed grass side down, acting like a thick hide protecting the thermal core. The middle layer is compacted earth with enormous weight, forming a massive thermal mass, and the outer layer is turf with the grass facing the sky, where interlocking roots naturally tighten the entire roof. When cold winds strike, the outer layer absorbs the first blow, the middle layer stores warmth like a giant battery, and the inner layer prevents any heat from escaping. What makes archaeologists go silent for a few seconds when they see the data is this. Even though it's made of dirt and living roots, this three-layer system slows heat loss more effectively than many 21st century standard wooden walls. But the most mysterious part is how it behaves almost like it has its own will. Self-regulating moisture, resisting fire, and sealing small cracks as the living roots continue to bind the structure. It isn't dead material. It's a breathing suit of armor, a living hybrid of soil and time, shielding the family inside from the attack of the white winter. And perhaps it's that contradiction, a house made of mud outperforming modern technology, that keeps Longhouses a living enigma of ancient engineering even today. Inside a longhouse, the air didn't exist as one uniform mass. It separated into three distinct layers, and each one was a life or death boundary anyone crossing it had to understand completely. The layer closest to the ground was always the coldest, where the air thickened and crawled like a liquid, cold enough to numb a person after just a few hours. Sleeping too low there, right above the ash and damp earth, meant having your body drained of heat minute by minute. A quiet death no one would notice until it was too late. But by sitting just half a meter higher, stepping into the middle layer, you'd enter the breathable zone. Warmer, the place where families set raised wooden beds to create a microclimate for everyone inside. This layer wasn't comfort. It was the narrow corridor of survival, where heat from people, fire, and even livestock formed a fragile warmth just enough to make it through the night. And above that, the third layer, a dense sea of smoke hanging under the roof, where the strongest heat accumulated but where danger was absolute. Sleeping too high, breathing that smoke for hours, could push a Viking into unconsciousness, and they would never wake up again. That's why a longhouse wasn't just built. It was calibrated with the human body itself. Every sleeping spot, every distance to the roof, every slat of the bed was balanced between two opposite threats: freezing to death or suffocating. In that world, lying in the wrong place wasn't an inconvenience. It was a decision that could end a life. In the thick darkness of the longhouse, where the fire smoldered and smoke clung to every beam, the Vikings had only one way to breathe: a small opening in the roof called a vindauga, wind eye. This is the original root of the word window, but the shocking part is that its first purpose had nothing to do with looking outside. It existed so people wouldn't suffocate. As the fire burned through the night, heat and smoke rose and pooled into a black sea just under the roof. If the vindauga wasn't opened at the right moment, the entire house could turn into a trap filled with choking smoke. But open it too long, even just a few seconds, and the 30°C wind would spear into the room, cutting through every bit of warmth. That's why the wind eye wasn't just a hole. It was a survival mechanism controlled by instinct, experience, and sometimes sheer risk. It had to open just enough to breathe, close fast enough to live, and be constantly adjusted to the night wind. The Vikings had no glass, no chimney, no ventilation system, only this tiny eye watching over the house's breath. And ironically, the thing we now associate with light was born as a desperate defense against silent death in the smoke. Inside a longhouse, the fire wasn't the strongest source of heat. The real engines were the living bodies standing silently in the dark, the livestock. A full-grown cow radiated as much heat as a small furnace, and when you kept an entire herd inside a sealed turf structure more than a meter thick, you weren't just sheltering animals. You were running a biothermal power plant. To modern people, it may sound crude, even poor, But in reality, this was a cold-blooded, precise strategy that makes many experts go quiet for a moment when they compare the numbers.
It's time to get
Because
out of this
while we
place.
boast about
We're not safe
HVAC
here.
systems, heat pumps, and smart sensors, the Vikings relied on something that needed no electricity, no fuel, and never shut off: animal body heat. And here's where the drama hits. The more livestock you had, the warmer your longhouse became. Not status, not wealth on paper, but your herd was the heater that determined whether your family lived or died in a 30-degree C winter. That's why the Fehu area, the livestock enclosure, wasn't just economic. It was a symbol of power. The more cattle a family owned, the warmer they lived. The warmer they lived, the healthier they stayed, and the better their chances of surviving the long winter. In the Viking world, staying warm wasn't a matter of architecture. It was a test of social strength. You might ask yourself, if you walked into a longhouse back then and found it unusually warm, was that a sign of wealth? Share your thoughts. In a society where the breath of livestock determined survival, who was truly powerful? Many people look at a longhouse and immediately think, just an old, simple, primitive home. But when you connect everything you've just seen, the turf walls thicker than a bunker, the 3-layer roof acting like a thermal battery, the 3-tier air system dividing the boundaries between life and death, the Vindauga wind eye preventing suffocation, and the livestock functioning as living furnaces, you realize that what stands before you isn't a house at all, but a survival machine calibrated to a frightening level of perfection. Here's the hook. The longhouse didn't try to create heat. It tried not to lose it. And that mindset, ancient as it seems, outperforms many modern homes that rely entirely on electricity, fans, heat pumps, and systems far too complex to save themselves when the power goes out. If the modern grid collapsed for just 3 days, most of our homes would turn into freezers. But a longhouse, built from earth, grass, and the breath of animals, would keep operating as if nothing had happened. And the final twist. When the climate dropped only 1 to 2 degrees during the Little Ice Age, this system broke, and the Norse civilization in Greenland vanished because it had been running at the limit for far too long. Their success and their collapse carry the same lesson. Survival depends not only on what you build, but on the buffer you leave for nature to shift. If you see this survival system differently, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden logic behind ancient structures like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story.